Hello, my name is Alberto Espay at the University of Cincinnati, or from the University of Cincinnati. We are at the American Academy of Neurology, and today I'm interviewing Dr. Jeremy Schmahmann. He is professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School and neurologist at the Massachusetts General Hospital, where he's director of the ataxia unit, a member of the Cognitive Behavioral Neurology Unit, and director of the Laboratory for Neuroanatomy and Cerebellar Neurobiology. Dr. Schmahmann presented the Frontiers in Neuroscience plenary session titled The Cerebellar Cognitive Affective Syndrome, Implications for Neurology and Psychiatry. Dr. Schmahmann, thank you very much for joining us today. This was perhaps one of the most elegant discussions on cerebellar anatomy, let alone the correlation between anatomy and behavior, and further down, even less likely for many of us who grew up in a neurological school that did not necessarily imply that there was any connection between the cerebellum and the cognitive and affective system. So could you give us a brief overview on the connection? How was it made between the cerebellum and the cognitive and affective functions?
Well, thank you, Alberto, and thank you for the opportunity to have this dialogue, and I look forward to questions from the audience if we have time as well. I'll answer the question of how I got into this because it's a story of clinical neurology. I got into cerebellum through the basal ganglia. I trained at Boston City Hospital, where Dr. Derek Denny Brown had been a major figure in neurology and has had a lasting influence in the field. He wrote extensively about basal ganglia and its role in motor control. I saw two patients early in my residency in the first year, one of whom had a stroke in the right head of the caudate nucleus with a neglect syndrome as a consequence. And we actually wrote that case up together with Dr. Lou Kaplan some years ago. And the second was a patient with a stroke in the genu of the internal capsule, also on the right, with a neglect syndrome contralaterally, which led me to the question with two aspects. Firstly is what is the neurobiology of attention, which took me directly into subcortical structures. And secondly, if the basal ganglia, which Denny Brown in his extensive work, which has stood the test of time, suggested was motor only, how can you have cognitive change from this motor structure? And then the leap was, if the basal ganglia can be cognitive, could the big motor machine downstairs, cerebellum, could that be cognitive as well? And that took me into a literature review, and I uncovered this rich archaeology going back to literally the 1830s, just a few years after Florenz had described cerebellum as being important in motor coordination. And this sort of a hidden treasure of case reports, anecdotal observations, and some of the physiology in the 1940s and 50s, looking at cerebellum beyond motor control, none of which we learned in medical school, none of which is translated into the textbooks. And that took me to the next question that arose from those first two cases is, can you use anatomy to explore the question of a cerebellar contribution to cognitive operations? And the next step from there was to work with Dr. Deepak Pandya, who became my teacher and mentor and friend for 3 decades, using neuroanatomy to study how the cerebral hemisphere is linked up with the cerebellum. And that began the journey, firstly of the anatomy, and then moving from there into the clinical neurology. But that's how the whole story started, was a clinical spark from a patient with a basal ganglia injury, neglect syndrome. Could cerebellum be cognitive as well? Finding something in the literature early on to suggest that could be. How do you explore that with scientific integrity and purpose now with what was then contemporary techniques?
Very interesting. So it really is fascinating to hear that connection with the patient because, of course, I would think that injury to the cerebellum may be as common as injury to other parts of the central nervous system. Yet it's interesting, as you're explaining, there must have been a gap in translation at some point between what we had seen or may have occurred in the cerebellum and the behaviors that were perhaps being unrecognized for many years until you began to try to sequence that back into the cerebellum. That, to me, is fascinating.
Yeah, I think you're emphasizing a point that we teach our students, which is you don't look at a patient or look at the exam, you look for. You study the patient's examination, looking for specific aspects of findings that could match the hypothesis that you've derived from the patient's opening line about their symptomatology. So you look for things, you don't just look at the patient. We all have had the experience, I think most neurologists have had the experience either in training or teaching in someone who has a cerebellum stroke and the patient has almost no motor findings. And to quote Marty Samuels, who's one of my teachers, you know, with a shrug and a smile, a sense of humor, you say, well, we see this. We have no idea why, but there it is. Or, well, the cerebellum is very plastic and it recovers fast. And I suspect what people were seeing, and when I talk about these cases, about the stroke in the posterior lobe of cerebellum and the absence of motor symptomatology, there's always nodding heads in the audience because everybody has seen these patients, that once the patient has recovered from the nausea, vomiting, and vertigo of the involvement of the midline nuclei or the vestibular system, there's almost no motor phenomenon. And the question then is, obviously, well, if there's a big stroke in the cerebellum and it's not motor, what on earth is it doing?
Right. And I think that then the other issue is the idea that we've learned from a lesion-based Oslerian type approach to understanding a deficit. A deficit is localized to where? You emphasize in your lecture that, in fact, the cerebellum is part of a node within networks, and perhaps by having discrete lesions in the cerebellum, we're disrupting a network that connects to the basal ganglia, connects to other parts of the brain. And it's, to me, fascinating to appreciate that the cerebellum has been very much neglected. I think it was in my education fear. It was a massive tissue underlying anything that's important, yet we fail to recognize that it was very much an active part of the networks that are cognitive, and some of them are motor, but we've been thinking it was just a motor-only structure.
Yeah, let me pick that up because you're exactly right. I think the question that you're framing really gets to the core of two things. One is our understanding of neurobiology in terms of the systems that subserve all of behavior, and the other is role of cerebellum specifically. There was a discussion, as you may know from the historical record, between the localizationists and the universalists. People who thought that the brain did everything everywhere, and those who felt there were specific nodes that were important for different functions. That argument is now long gone because we understand about distributed neural circuits. One of my students, Joseph Parvizi, talked about the corticocentric myopia, focusing only on the cerebral cortex and forgetting all the subcortical areas, the white matter, the cerebellum, thalamus, for example. And we now understand that, based on the work that I have done with my colleague and teacher, Dr. Pandya, every cortical area is connected to other regions of the same cerebral hemisphere, the contralateral cerebral hemisphere, the striatum, and the brainstem, the thalamus through the projection fibers, or pons, and then going down into spinal cord. So every cortical area has all these connections. No region of the cerebral cortex is an island unto itself. These cerebral cortical connections that lead from cerebral hemisphere down to cerebellum and cerebellum back with topographic precision make it very clear that, as true as it is for thalamic connections with cerebral cortex, basal ganglia, the caudate, putamen, striatum, the tripartite division of basal ganglia, their connections with cerebral cortex. The same is true for cerebellum. There are motor regions, there are cognitive regions, there are limbic regions, and we know where they are now. We have this from task-based imaging, we have it from resting state connectivity, we have it from lesion studies in animals, and most importantly, we have it from clinical studies in patients. Midline lesions produce the affective change, anterior lobe lesions produce the motor ataxia syndrome, and posterior lobe lesions produce the cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome. So now that we can recognize that, we can see cerebellum as part of the distributed neural circuitry subserving all these different functions. And the idea is that the cerebellar anatomy within the cerebellum itself is not homogeneous like the liver, but there's a repeating consistency to the architecture of cerebellum and the corticonuclear microcomplex that comprises cerebellum. And that architecture allows cerebellum, we think, to do one kind of transformation on information. It does one thing. but it does that to all the streams of information passing through it, connecting to different parts of the brain, so that therefore it makes sense that cerebellum is involved in motor control, it's involved in cognitive operations, language, visual spatial processing, multitasking, executive functions, and then the limbic component in the midline with affective regulation and things like social cognition.
Yeah. Let me then use that to move on to the last part on the therapy that you highlighted in your talk. And perhaps I'm thinking that because of the posterior location of the cognitive/emotional part of the cerebellum, it may be amenable to repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation. And I was impressed by a case you showed where someone apparently who had been in a state of emotional disrepair, sounds like a variety of different difficulties, came back to life with just this therapy. And I'm curious about what does it mean in terms of other individuals with cerebellar dysfunction. Could this be also translatable to motor difficulties from the cerebellum, so ataxic patients that may not have as much of a cognitive component, or is this something that by virtue of the location of the cognitive cerebellum that you might be in position to use this therapy only for those kinds of patients?
So the question is, how do you translate theory into therapy? And does it work for motor phenomenology as well as the cognitive emotional? This case you're mentioning was just the most extraordinary situation. This father came to us in despair 2 or so years after the hemorrhage in the cerebellum of this young girl, and she was devastated. And we took a gamble that said we're doing TMS in the cerebellum in schizophrenia in the hope that we can upregulate cerebellar modulation of cerebral circuits. We could try this here. I don't know if it's going to have any impact, but if he's willing to go through that as a single case, let's go ahead and do that. And her response was extraordinary. She's not back to totally fine, but she's certainly way improved. Both the patient, who's now at the moment in college, and the family, who's ecstatic about her results.
Was that a single therapy?
It was a week of TMS, the vermis in the cerebellum done
with sustained benefit?
Yes, in collaboration with Felipe Frenier at the Spaulding Rehabilitation Hospital in Boston. So we're hoping that this is not just a one-off event, and we'll be planning this kind of study in the future as well to see if we can make sure this does in fact replicate. What it tells us is that TMS is doing something at the physiological electrochemical level to make a difference to neural function. One imagines that you're enhancing the cerebral cortical networks, and in fact we know that now for sure because TMS, as I showed in the talk, in collaboration with the Pasqualeone lab in Boston, influences different upstairs cerebral networks depending on where you stimulate in the cerebellum. So we know about that relationship of the ability to modulate cerebral networks through cerebellar stimulation. We have this experience in this one patient. We've seen it in schizophrenia where we can produce some improvements in the phenomenology. There are trials of TMS in ataxia. It's a little harder to get at the anterior lobe because it's buried under the occipital pole, but there are some promising stories about TMS and ataxia. I think the larger picture is it allows us to think about brain modulation using the cerebellum as our window into the brain. And because it has such widespread projection to the cerebral hemispheres, perhaps we can even have a larger impact through the cerebellar stimulation than we may have from upstairs stimulation. So the theory about cerebellar connectivity with cerebral cortex and its translation into therapy is a very exciting new opportunity for us.
It's fascinating. Well, I thank you very much for your thoughts. I was intrigued by the whole presentation. AANondemand.com is the site where we all should go to and check this presentation. I'll do it, as I mentioned to you before, a couple of times before I can say I have digested your presentation. I love the concept of this metria of thought very much. Quite elegant way to think about the cognitive and emotional cerebellum. I thank you very much, Dr. Schmahmann, for your presentation, and I commend you for all you've done for the field. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alberto.
All right.